Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the maritime culture and its effect on the Viking Age. Um, this is by me, Alicia Silverthorne, and I took the roles of being the leader and the connector, as well as Zane Clement. Sorry if I said your last name wrong, Zane. Um, and he is the recorder and the editor. So, who were the Vikings? The Vikings were seafaring Scandinavian people that originated from the modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Vikings were skilled warriors, but just as importantly were excellent navigators and seafarers, innovating in a plethora of ways to more efficiently raid, pillage, and sail. Known for their exploration, raiding, trading, and settling in the new lands between the 8th and the 11th centuries, we will be circling on their innovations and seafaring explorations of the 9th century, where they traveled vast distances. The Vikings reached as far as North America, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. So, Vikings and the maritime culture in the 9th century. Possibly one of the most impactful attributes of the Vikings were their seafaring ability and their maritime culture, allowing them to spread across all through Europe and the North Sea. It is very unlikely that the Vikings would have had as much success with pillaging and voyaging without their affinity for navigation, shipbuilding, and ingenuity. The image here is the Museum of the Viking Age. So the age of the Vikings. The age of the Vikings, the Vikings first landed in England in 793 AD, raiding the Lindisfarne monastery in Northumberland, which many historians consider this the ultimate beginning of the Viking Age. 2 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, more Vikings raided parties had begun to pillage the surrounding islands. The islands, monasteries Skye, Ion, and Rathlin were struck by the Vikings. Vikings exploration and expansion. Vikings traveled to British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, Vinland. The Vikings innovated the shipbuilding. Specifically, the longship allowed them to explore vast territories capable of versatile navigation through harsh open seas and narrow river passages. Through this advantage, establishing settlements and trading routes. Notable exploration. Leif Erikson voyaged to Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland, around 1000 AD. And if you look at the picture to the right here, you can see moving people and changing places. So part of the routes consisted of Norway and Sweden, which we know is where um, Vikings are from when it comes to modern day countries. And then we see that they went south towards Denmark, Germany, France, England, Ireland, Scotland, um, and all throughout those southern sea borders. Then we can see that they also went east towards Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, which is considered the current day North America. So, how did the Vikings become such skilled navigators and shipbuilders? While it may be common knowledge that Vikings were skilled sailors, many may not know the reasoning behind their affinity. Vikings were dependent on the sea in many ways. As living in regions with vast coasts and dotted with islands, the sea was a vital part of Viking culture for trade, voyage, and pillaging. The reliance on the sea, intertwined with the Viking culture, had produced a very efficient and knowledgeable seafaring maritime and culture. So, Vikings' innovation of cultural practices. One of the many innovations that was a product of Viking culture was the longship, a vessel suitable for both open sea voyages and navigating through rivers. The longship was a ship perfectly suited for Vikings and their culture of seafaring, pillaging, and warfare. The longship had included a shallow draft, which meant that they could travel further onto beaches, facilitating easier raiding and trade. Yet, another sample of Vikings innovated for a more efficient method of their cultural behaviors. One of the impacts of Viking culture on their warfare and seafaring practices would be the technique innovations. For example, The Vikings would notably harness both wind through sails as well as use oars to manually power the vessel, allowing for constant efficiency even if the wind was pushing them in the wrong direction or even nowhere at all. The Vikings' legacy. So, cultural influences. Viking sagas, or cultural influences that we see um, in our day to day or in modern day media. So, first we see Viking sagas, tales of Norse gods such as like Thor and Odin, and mythology continued to shape modern literature and entertainment, such as like the Marvel Thor. Their exploration and naval technology influenced later European expansion and maritime powers. Another modern impact is the legacy of Viking navigation is evident in the development of modern naval exploration and international trade. So let's get into the Viking social structure. So first we have kings and jarls. Um, the rulers of the Viking societies were often hereditary and wielded a significant power, especially in battle. Kings like Harald Fairhair and Olaf Tryggvason are notable historical figures. Another one is Karls. The free man often are farmers or craftsmen who make up the majority of the Viking society. So in modern day, this would be considered the working class. Then there's thralls. These are slaves captured during raids who had few rights and were unfortunately often forced to work in households or on farms. Moving forward, when it comes to religion, they had poly polytheistic beliefs. So the Vikings worshipped a pantheon of gods, with Odin, the god of war and wisdom, being the most important. Other gods included Thor and thunder god, and Frisia, the goddess of love and war. There's also Norse mythology. So central to Viking culture, Norse mythology included tales of heroes, gods, and the afterlife. Valhalla, a grand hall in Asgard, was believed to be the final resting place for warriors who died in battle. Moving forward, let's talk about the Vikings' art and technology. So, first thing we get to talk about is longships. These were long, narrow boats that allowed Vikings to travel quickly across seas and rivers. These ships were designed for both raiding and exploration, with shallow drafts enabling them to navigate shallow waters. Next is runestones. As you can see, a runestone example is in the picture on the left here. So these are just large stones inscribed with runes that documented Viking achievements. Um, memorize It memorialized the dead and provided historical records. So just a lot of symbolism behind these stones. Last, there's craftsmanship. So Vikings excelled in metalworking, wood carving, and shipbuilding, as we've talked about previously. They left behind stunning artifacts, including weapons, jewelry, and intricate carvings. Oop, excuse me. Viking expansion and exploration. Viking raids and settlements. Vikings raids began as a response to overpopulation and the need for resources. Vikings first raided monastery towns along the coast for Britain and Ireland. As they settled, they created new colonies in places such as Iceland, Greenland, and Faroe Islands. Some of the most notable settlements include establishments of Dublin in Ireland, York in England. Discovery of North America. Leif Erikson is credited with discovering Vinland, part of modern-day Newfoundland, which is technically North America. This discovery occurred around year 1000, a full 500 years before Columbus. Archaeological sites like Lanais, Ox Meadows in Canada, confirming Viking presence in North America, where they traded and interacted with the indigenous peoples. Vikings and global theme of migration. So, migration and cultural exchange. The Vikings' migration, similar to other large scale migratory movements in history, had significant culture and genetic impacts on the region they settled in. Their extensive trade routes facilitated the exchange of goods like silk, spices, precious metals with culture as far flung as the Byzantine Empire and the Arab world in the Mediterranean. The Viking legacy. So, genetic studies show traces of Viking ancestry in populations across British Isles, Iceland, Scotland, and part of France, which is Normandy. The Dale Law in England and Normandy in France both show how Viking culture and governance influences later European political structures, such as feudalism. So when it comes to the end of the Viking Age, factors that led to the end was the rise of a stronger centralized kingdoms in Europe, such as Alfred the Great's defense in England, which made it more difficult for Viking forces to raid effectively. The Christianization of Vikings. As many Vikings converted to Christianity, their traditional way of life began to change. The transition from pagan beliefs to Christianity led to greater integration into the European society. Another thing is the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. This decisive battle marked the final defeat of Viking forces in England. King Harold Godwin defeated King Harold Harada, ending the Vikings' attempts to invade England. Viking settlements versus raiding. The Vikings shifted from raiding to settling in established territories as they integrated into European cultures. The formation of the Norman kingdom, the descendants of the Vikings in France, is a prime example of this cultural assimilation. So, how did the Vikings age relate to our present reality? So, first we have global impact of Viking exploration. The Vikings paved the way for future exploration and expansion. Their navigational techniques and shipbuilding innovations influenced later explorers such as Columbus. Viking trade routes helped link diverse cultures, and this cultural exchange helped lay the groundwork for the development of a more interconnected world. Next is the cultural and genetic legacy. The Vikings' influence is still felt today, both in terms of genetic heritage, for example, Viking descendant populations in Iceland, and cultural practices, such as places of names, language, and legal systems. Viking myths, tales, and imaginary and imagery remain popular in modern cultures, with portrayals in books, films, and TV series such as Vikings. Last is the relevance to modern day immigration. Much like the Vikings, modern societies experience waves of migration. Whether through exploration, trade, or seeking better opportunities, migration continues to shape our cultural identities. Issues like migration, reform, and the integration of immigrants into societies that can be traced back to historical movements such as Vikings' own migrations and settlements. Now we have come to a conclusion to this presentation, and some of the key takeaways that Zayn and I have found was first that the Vikings were more than just raiders. They were innovators in exploration, cultural exchange, and social organization. The Vikings were successful and largely in part due to the innovation of maritime culture and their reliance on the sea, creating large advancements that gave them clear advantages in warfare and raiding and trade. Our third takeaway is the legacy of the Viking Age continues to shape the modern world, especially in terms of migration, trade, and cultural influence. Last but not least, understanding the Vikings' impacts helps us reflect on how migration histories shape societies and the connections between past and present. This is our bibliography. We have the Museum of the Viking Age, people moving people, changing places, Age of Vikings, who were the Vikings, the Age of the Vikings, once again, Viking legacy, social um, kind of ladder. There's art and tech, expansion, exploration, global theme of migration, as well as a timeline. Now, I hope that you were able to get a good